All right, welcome back to episode 44 of the Bible Connection podcast. So, guys, this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan. We're just here to just encourage you to keep on going through the Bible with us this year. So, I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are a couple of my good friends, John Steinke.
Hello there.
And Taylor Babcock.
Glad to be here.
This week we're without Brandon, so be in prayer for his family. And hopefully we'll see him in a couple episodes. But this week...
His grandfather passed away, by the way,
yeah.
in case people were wondering.
So, well, this week, we're going to knock out Micah. I think Taylor is going to head this up for us. So, Taylor, first question. What I want to know is, who was Micah, and when did he live?
So, Micah was a prophet that lived in Moresheth, which is a town in southern Judah, about 22 miles southwest of Jerusalem. So, he prophesied during the reigns of the Judean kings Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and overlapped with the prophet Isaiah in the timeline. His name means "who is like Yahweh." So during the 850 to 750 BC time frame, both Judah and Israel underwent considerable economic growth due to a weakened Assyrian state. The Aramean and Assyrian empires were preoccupied with positioning themselves against each other and trying to control trade routes and so forth, and this ultimately allowed opportunity for both Judah and Israel to regain lost territory previously under the control of the Arameans and develop economic activity within their nations. So this time of economic growth led to the demise of the hearts of both Israel and Judah. Enamored with the riches that they had acquired, they began to worship pagan gods, forgetting Yahweh. So they both developed an upper wealthy class within their societies, and they end up exploiting and oppressing the poor. If you have read through the book of Amos, Amos was a prophet who spoke against the northern kingdom Israel, and likewise addressed many of the same issues that Micah had seen. So Micah addressed both Israel and Judah with idolatry, seizure of property, poor civil, religious, and prophetic leadership, faithless religious practices, and many of an assortment of corrupt business practices and affairs. So these issues, which were somewhat, or you could say, sparked by a rise of the wealth within their nations, are addressed throughout Micah's book. The northern kingdom Israel actually fell during Micah's ministry in 722, while the southern kingdom of Judah almost fell in about 701, so a time later. So there's an overlap of the kingdoms, and you see which Micah is prophetically speaking during some other prophets during this time of economic wealth.
All right, so real quick, what was the theme of Micah's book, and what was his message to the nations?
Micah's message was directed toward Israel, Samaria, and Jerusalem, Judah, prophesying Assyria and Babylon as instruments of God's judgment for their sin. The theme of his book is about judgment and forgiveness. So because of the sin that Israel committed, God must uphold his justice accordingly. However, the Lord is faithful to his covenants and full of mercy. So there's a structure within the book that we'll see that here soon. Shepherding language is used throughout the book, which ultimately points to the promise that a shepherd king will deliver his people. In chapter 3, verse 8, "But as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression, and to Israel his sin." So if you read through the book, there's 7 chapters. You can actually divide it into 3 sections. Each of these 3 sections start with the Hebrew word for hear, or Shema. Chapters 1 and 2 are about the general accusations and warnings against both nations and the people. Chapters 3 through 5 record the injustices of the rulers, leaders, and prophets. And chapters 6 through 7 show some of the unjust economic practices and business practices that were going on from a day to day. So each of these 3 sections, if you divide them up, start with a section of judgment and then cycle through and conclude with a message of salvation and restoration to the people of Israel. So there's a cycle of judgment and salvation, which each of these 3 sections have, and that really kind of underlines the theme of Micah, judgment and salvation. So in this first section, in chapters 1 and 2, you see the punishment of Samaria and Judah, and they're described actually in verses 1, 6 through 7. Therefore, I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards, and I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. All her carved images shall be beaten to pieces. All her wages shall be burned with fire, and all her idols I will lay waste. For from the fee of a prostitute she gathered them, and to the fee of a prostitute they shall return. So Samaria collected gifts that were paid to temple prostitutes, and the Assyrians are using them to pay their own prostitutes. They worshipped Assyrian gods in the temples, and Assyria wiped them out. So God used just punishment. The punishment, you could say, fits the crime. So these chapters show how the people are abusing Yahweh's land and are acting oppressively. Through these chapters, you'll see that prophets were actually taking bribes to offer promises of God to the people, and there was a lot of greed and theft that were allowing the people to become wealthy, and a lot of under-the-table things that were happening that allowed them to get to the positions that they were. So despite their unfaithfulness and all that we read, this first section concludes with a promise that God will shepherd the remnant of Israel. I will assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. So we see that it concludes with a message of hope and restoration in this first section. The second section, in chapters 3 to 5, we see how the leaders and the rulers are taking advantage of the land. So the poor are deprived of the land, and they're losing it, and they're put in situations in which they are subject to lose what they rightfully own. And they are actually selling the land in order to maintain what is being demanded of them from the wealthy class. So this is actually a Torah violation. If you read in Leviticus 25 and Numbers 36, it's illegal to sell family land, at least permanently. So once again, we see that God is bringing judgment, and he is bringing disaster to come out and wipe out the northern kingdom for what they're doing. We see this prominently over the nation. And like the first section in chapters 1 and 2, after all of this, we see that this next section concludes with a message of hope and restoration once again. So, and speaking of Jerusalem, chapter 4 says, "And many of the nations shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths.'" So we see God's promise to fill his city with all the peoples from all the nations from across the earth. I think that's an ongoing theme that we see through the prophets, that there's this message of judgment in what they have done, and because of their sin, God is rightfully bringing in Assyria or Babylon to come in, bring about justice. But because of God's mercy, he restores them. And when he restores them, it's not just the nation of Israel, but rather all peoples from all corners of the earth are brought in. And we see that here in Micah. So therefore, we see that God becomes the king of all nations, and all people are submitting to him. As king, everyone is worshiping his reign. There will be, and you continue to read, and there will be a restoration for the Babylonian exile, and God will bring them back into the land. And when you get to chapter 5, and there will be a ruler to be born in Bethlehem, we see that to be the promise of the Messianic king being fulfilled. In verses 2 through 6, I'm going to skip through you. "But you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel." We go down a little further in verse 4, "And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord." And it concludes, but further on down, "And he shall be their peace." There's a promise of the Messianic king, and that Messianic king is to come from Bethlehem, the same place that David was born. So the city of David, which is Bethlehem, is where the Messianic king should arise. And we see that is actually fulfilled in the gospel accounts. If you read through the Gospels of Matthew and John, it records this, that Bethlehem is the place of where Jesus was born. And they're debating it in John chapter 7. Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? So we see that promise and that prophetic language is fulfilled. If you keep on reading in verse 6, right after this, we see there's talk of the Assyrians, and that the Messianic king, that the shepherd that is to be born, will have power and control over. We see that Assyria is used here, and this promise is using Assyria as an archetype of the evil that shall be overcome. So by the time Jesus is on the scene in the New Testament, Assyria is not the world power or the one in control, but we see many other nations rise and fall. But Assyria is used as a type of evil, that there will be many Assyrians to come and many Assyrians later on that the Messianic king shall rise and have power over. So we see that Assyria is used as that type, similar to how we see Gog in Genesis chapter 10 be used again in Ezekiel, I think 36 or 37, 38, 39, one of the 30s.
Yeah, Ezekiel late 30s.
Late 30s. In the late 30s of Ezekiel, it's not 36, 37, but that Gog is used as an archetype of evil in which God overcomes. The final section, chapters 6 and 7, record Israel's unjust economic practices. What does the Lord want? It plainly says it out in 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So we see all these unjust economic practices kind of laid out in the rest of chapter 6. And what's going on through them in verses 11 and 12, shall acquit the man with wicked scales and with a bag of deceitful weights. Your rich men are full of violence, your inhabitants speak lies, and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. So Micah is prophesying judgment that is to come upon them for all that they have done. And this continues into chapter 7, laying out how the land is wicked and unjust, and saying even that the godly have perished from the earth, and almost that Micah feels that he is by himself, almost. So like the first two sections, this last section concludes and ends on a positive note of a restoration. We read through verses 18 through 20, showing God's mercy and faithfulness to the covenant he made with Abraham. So starting in chapter 7, verse 18, who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in steadfast love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast out our sins into the depths of the sea. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. These last three verses, along with the book of Jonah, were actually read annually and are read annually in the synagogues on the afternoon of the Day of Atonement. That's Yom Kippur. So it's interesting that these three verses are read because there's great significance to them. So this wasn't required in Torah, but actually shows that these were recognized and sought to be looked forward and upheld. The people have sinned, and God is righteous to judge. Likewise, God is full of mercy and faithful to his covenant promises. Like Micah's own name, who is like Yahweh, the book concludes with this phrase, or in this last passage of the phrase, who is a God like you?
So what I like about what you were saying with all this is how we looked at the progression from where they broke the law in the beginning broke the law of Moses, and they're going to be judged, and in the end that redemption and the preservation of the remnant is going to come in. But one of the things that always used to confuse me about that is, like, I don't get it. Like, do they deserve to be punished or they don't? Like, are they, we see in the beginning, you talked about all the stuff that they were being judged for, right? They were looking at the oppressed in the land, and they were further oppressing them. They were basically buying out their land permanently and buying people into slavery, this wicked treatment of the people in the land, right?
Yeah, yes.
And so as they're doing that, we see in chapter 2, verse 3, therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, against this family I'm devising disaster, from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk haughtily. It will be a time of disaster. And so when we're looking at, like, the punishment, and then you talk about how there's, like, a remnant that's going to come out of it, you go, like, well, why a remnant? Don't they deserve to be punished? And, like, if they need to be rescued out of this, then why didn't God just keep them from making these mistakes in the first place? It's always this thing that went through my brain. But one of the things, it's not just like they were punished for a time and then they got out of punishment. right? Like it's like you were saying in chapter 5. So I'll back up a little bit because this really was awesome for me when I was reading Micah this week. It says in the end of chapter 2 that like a shepherd, verse 12, I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. So there's going to be a remnant from Israel. But he picks up on that language a little bit more specifically in chapter 4, like a pregnant woman. And in verse 10 of chapter 4, he says, Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon, and there you will be rescued, and there the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. And what this reminded me of was what Brandon was talking about in the book of Ruth. If you remember Naomi, she left the land of Israel. She went to this foreign nation, right, where she had these sons that got married to these daughters, and the sons died. And when she came back into Israel, she thought that everything was empty, that she'd lost it all, but she brought back with her Ruth. And through Ruth, right, when she's pregnant and she has this baby, Obed, with Boaz, we get redemption for Israel. We get this Obed, this servant who's the ancestor of David. And David's going to be the redemption for the entire land. So she went into this exile and she brought back full, right? She brought back with more than she left. And so when the Lord's sending the remnant into exile, he's sending them out in judgment like a pregnant woman. And it's going to be painful, like labor. But from that labor is where you get what you were reading in chapter 5, where you, O Bethlehem, are too little among the clans of Judah, but from you shall come forth for me one who is a ruler in Israel, like the Ancient of Days. Well, what's the Ancient Days? This is a reference back to the promised child all the way back in the garden, right? The seed that would come and crush the head of the serpent. Therefore, he shall give them the time when she who is in labor has given birth. That woman who went into exile, that metaphor he's establishing, now metaphorically, she shall give birth, and like the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel and shall stand as that shepherd. But what's really amazing is, okay, now the remnant's brought out, all of the world's going to be rescued. Drop down to verse 8. The remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations in the midst of many peoples. So through this exile is the way like you and I and Josh and all of us other non-Jews are brought into the family of God. This is a picture of Christ. Christ is coming in, and he is going to be able to bring in all the nations with him, and it's just really cool when you look at it.
Absolutely. I love it. And as you're reading through that, I think of Abraham, the father of many nations.
Yes.
This is fulfilling that. And
yes.
It's just, there's so much language in here that shows, and not just in Micah, but there's, that promise was never forgotten by God.
Yeah.
It wasn't just Israel in the long game. It was all peoples of the earth that God was redeeming and bringing back in. And it's just amazing to see this. And
that promise to Abraham you're talking about is the very last verse of the book of Micah. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, or father of many nations, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. So I just thought that was a really great way to emphasize the book of Micah.
I agree. I think it's amazing.
All right, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Bible Connection podcast. So I just want to say thank you so much for everyone that takes the time to listen every week. We just hope this podcast equips and encourages you. So if you have any questions, you can leave a comment on YouTube. We have an email on screen. I just hope you have a blessed day. And